I would like you to turn to Isaiah chapter 46. And before we go there and start looking at it, I've titled my sermon today, Dead Center. Dead Center. Now, when Donald was speaking this morning in the lesson, in the Sabbath school time, and he was talking about death, I was quite amazed because I was talking about dead centers. What's another word for dead centers? Every place, every town has a dead center. Now, normally in the olden days, the dead center would be in the middle of town. But nowadays, dead centers aren't always in the middle of town. Dead centers can be on the outskirts of town. For example, on your way to Simonstown, there are 2 dead centers on your way there. And what are the dead centers? Cemeteries, that's correct. I don't know how many of you walk around in cemeteries. I don't walk around there at night because I'm scared. But I do walk around during the day. I go and I read what's going on the tombstones. I read the tragic stories, especially the ones in Simonstown, the one right there at the naval cemeteries. You read about the boats that sank and how many people died, and you look at the age group, they usually young men. Then you read about a disease that affected a lot of them and they died from that. And then you see little ones where it's a baby. And as you walk around there, one thing I noticed while walking around there, it's very quiet. Not a lot of noise. If people are walking around there, they're not shouting, they're whispering. And I wondered why they were whispering. Maybe the dead would wake up. And I was wondering to myself as I looked there, even though the gravestones look beautiful, some of the graves really look neglected. As I was looking at all of this, I was thinking to myself, how many of us wish that we could just have some peace and quiet? And then it made me think of Norman Vincent Peale. He's an old speaker, promotional speaker, I would say a person that gave a lot of businessmen good advice. And he tells a story about how that when he was a young man, he used to sell typewriters. Now, and most of you don't know what typewriters are, but they are those things that you push with your fingers like that, and you used to type letters and do all kinds of things with. Nowadays, we use computers that do spell check for you. But he was selling typewriters, and he started to sell a particular one, which when I started to work was really fancy. It had like a ball. It wasn't one that moved up and down. It was one that like a ball, and it would spin around and hit, and it was really incredible. And he would sell that. But times would be hard, and every now and then he would get a letter from people saying, you owe us money. And he would just say, yes, I owe you money. But he couldn't do anything about it because he didn't have any money. Then finally they would send him a letter, which was a red letter. And the red letter would say, this is the final notice. Why aren't you paying us your money? And he would tell us the only reason why he's not paying it. What is it? Why do you think he's not paying it, Diane? Because he just doesn't have any money. And he said anybody would know that why you're not paying is because you don't have any money. And he realized something, and this is what I want to tell you about dead centers. Do you know that they have no problems? Do you know that? People who are on the dead centers have absolutely no problems. So if you are living and you have no problems, I think you need to get on your knees and start praying, because you're about to go to the dead centers. You see, living people have problems. If you don't have problems, dear friends, that is a problem. Now you might wonder, why am I talking about this? I would like you to go with me to Isaiah chapter 46. But this time I want to start with verse 3. Isaiah 46 verse 3. It says, "Listen to me, you descendants of Jacob, all the remnant of the people of Israel." So we have the two groups of people there, and maybe as you look at it, you know old Jacob, and then all of a sudden you have the remnant of the people of Israel, and immediately you're looking at perhaps the nation of Israel. In the one case, you look at an individual by the name of Jacob, and in the next one, you're looking at a nation. But I want you to understand that this message is applicable to a Jacob, and it's applicable to a nation. So what God is saying is, listen to me, you individual, and listen to me, you nation. The interesting thing that I have discovered is that what happens in the micro world, you know what a micro world is? That'll be the individual, is basically going to be the general thing of what's happening to the macro world, and that's the nation. Sometimes the macro world, which is a nation, is only doing what the individual is really up to. You'll see why I'm saying this. So here we see a person by the name of Jacob, and I'm always intrigued because Jacob means deceiver. Jacob means an ankle grabber. Jacob means somebody that you cannot trust. The only person that he has in mind is himself. That's a Jacob. And the general consensus of the world is that most people in the world are just interested in their well-being. Sometimes they might make it out that they are interested in your well-being, but the moment you don't pay them for their services, they aren't interested in you anymore, and then you find out that they were really more interested in themselves, what they could get out of you. Sadly, dear friends, a lot of us fall into that category. I know of one young man, when I said to him, "Why don't you go and help that person?" He says, "Because that person can't pay me." And I wondered, if we did the work that we were doing and we didn't get paid for it, would we still do it? And so I realized a lot of us are Jacobs. And the interesting thing about Jacob is that you know that one day he wrestled with God. And although he was still a Jacob, in his wrestling match with God, God changed his name to Israel. And Israel means one who has wrestled with God and prevailed. One who's had the victory. One who's gained the graces of God. One who has found the favor of God. That's an Israelite. Now, a lot of us sitting here were once upon a time Jacobs. Then we had a wrestling match with God, and we have now received the title as Israel. But I want you to notice why I'm saying this. If you happen to be a Jacob, or if you happen to be an Israel, the message that you're about to hear is to both of you. God isn't saying to the Israelites, "I like you," and God isn't saying to the Jacob, "I don't like you." Listen to what God is saying to Jacob and to Israel, to the Christian and the non-Christian, to the believer and the non-believer, to the rich and the poor, to those who love God and those who don't love God. Listen to what God is saying to you. He is saying, "You whom I have upheld since your birth." Okay, what is that telling you? That at your birth, God was there. At your birth, He was the one that was witness to you. at your birth, he was actually seeing the fruits of what has happened in the mother's womb. You were somebody that he had taken note of at your birth. You whom I have upheld from your birth. So even though you weren't conscious of this, God has been with you from your birth. Okay, I want you just to hear this. Very important. And have carried you since you were born. Now, when I just think about this, one thing about us as parents, when we have children, we carry our children. Isn't that true? And finally, when our children get bigger and they start walking and they still want to be carried, we have to really dig deep to carry them. Isn't that true? Finally, when they get to about the age of 21 and they're already learning to work for themselves, but they still come to us to carry them, we start feeling a bit overwhelmed. Isn't that true? I remember my son came to visit us one day, and I was telling him how I used to carry him around. And he said to me, "Dad, you can't do that anymore." And I said, "I can." And I found out I couldn't. You see, sometimes we can't carry people anymore. And one of the hardest things for us is to recognize when we can't do it anymore. And again, when a child can come to a parent, that's really good news. But then your parents die, and you are now a parent, and the person you used to go to help carry you is no longer there. How do you feel now? Are there moments in your life, no matter how old you are, that you wish you could be a child again? That you wish that you didn't have all the responsibilities you have? That you wish that you could just be carefree? Are you like that? Dear friends, I find myself many times missing my dad. Not so much for the money, but missing him for the discussions. When my father passed away, my older brother became that person I would speak to. We would sit around the table and we would discuss life. And then my brother died. And it becomes kind of, I wish I had somebody that I could talk to. Now listen to this. Verse 4. Those of you who have grey hair and those of you who have disguised your grey hair, verse 4 says, even to your old age and grey hairs, I am he who will sustain you. I have made you, and I will carry you, and I will sustain you, and I will rescue you. How do you like that? Here we are, the aged, who most people turn to for us to carry them. But the good news is that you have somebody who is still carrying you, who will still be with you. He's been with you from the time you were born, and he will be with you when you've got grey hair. Hey, Barbara. And he will rescue you, and he will carry you, as he has said. And then he says these words, with whom will you compare me or count me equal? With whom? To whom will you liken me that we may be compared? Now it's so interesting here, he asks a question. And then we get verse 6. And verse 6 is quite tragic. He's just asked you, who will you compare me with? And then all of a sudden he brings out something that somehow we do compare him with. And I want you just to keep your finger there and just jump over to Matthew chapter 6 with me, please. Because although he's asked the question, who will you compare me with? He actually answers that and he says, there is somebody that you compare me with. And in Matthew chapter 6, he says, verse 24, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And then he says what? You cannot serve both God and money. Dear friends, it's sad. Go back to 46. God asks the question, who will you compare me with? And then he answers it, that you compare me with a bag of gold. You compare me with a person of silver. In actual fact, you look at gold as the very means of saving you. When you cry out, gold comes to your rescue. And dear friends, it's really tragic, but it's really like that in the church. When people come to you and they need help, most of the time they're asking for financial help. And then I think of the story of Peter and John on the way to Gate Beautiful, on the way to the sanctuary. As they go there, they see this man, and what's everybody asking for? They're asking for money. It's not uncommon. But who do we compare God with? Sadly, dear friends, we look at him as a bag full of money. And the bad news is, if somebody comes to you and they're considering you to be the bag of money and you don't give them money, how do they feel about you? They really don't like you. And so many times we go to God and what we're requesting of him is we don't realize that he's been looking after us, he's been carrying us, he's been saving us. But when we compare him to a bag of gold. We compare him to silver. And Christ himself is knowledgeable. He says you can't serve two gods. You can only serve one. Choose. Who will you compare me to? And dear friends, in most cases, when it comes down to the crunch, we all ask ourselves this question. Did I put enough away? Or do we ask ourselves, will God still look after me as he looks after me before? Who do we turn to? You know, in the olden days, there used to be an advertisement. Who do you have to thank? Worland Bank. Do you remember? It's now F&B. But, banking institutions have become the means of salvation. But I want you to listen to what God says about this. He says, some pour out gold from their bags and weigh out silver on the scales. And then they do something. They hire a goldsmith to make it into a god. We go to people and we ask them to take our gold and to make it more than what it is so that it'll look after us. We become dependent on that person who can take what we've given them and make it come alive. How many of us don't do that? We might not be good at making our silver and our gold real, but we go to people who we think can do that. We ask them to take our gold and to take our silver, and we ask them to make a god of it. But then God says, we then bow down to it, we worship it, Then we lift it up on our shoulders, and when people say to us, how did you manage to do it? Well, we invested wisely. Well, we did this, and we made sure that we would never get caught with our pants down. And we lift gold up on our shoulders, and we give the impression to people around us that the one who has carried us from our womb up to where we are with grey hair has been the works of our hands, the gods of our hands. Dear friends, because it's sad. When I hear people come to me, they're not asking for God, they're asking for money. Does money hear their cry? Jesus says they set it up in a place and there it stands. From that spot, it cannot move. Even though someone cries out to it, it cannot answer. It cannot save them from their troubles. Did you hear that? So I'm saying to you today, dear friends, it's time for us to recognize that the things of our hands cannot save us. It's time for us to recognize, as God says, who can you compare me with? One thing about God, He says, and I want you to notice this, He says in verse 8, remember this. You're going to be leaving now in the next few minutes. And before we leave, I want to tell you something prophetically. The light is going to go on. But I'm hoping that the light will not only go on physically, but that the light will go on in your minds today to recognize. Remember this. Keep it in mind. Take it to heart, you rebels. Remember the former things, those of long ago. What's He asking you to remember? He's asking you to remember those troubled times that you had. Can some of you look back on those troubled times? And what do you know about those troubled times? You didn't have money at those troubled times, but you did have God at those troubled times. And did He help you in those troubled times? Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God and there is none other. I am God and there is none like me. Then He says this, I make known the end from the beginning. From ancient times, what is to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. That's amazing to me. You know what Nebuchadnezzar concluded at the end of his conversion? He had been eating grass for 7 years. When you spoke to him, he would moo. But one day, listen to this, dear friends, when he finally, as the word says, came to his senses. That's what the word says. He came to his right mind. And then he says these words. And I wonder sometimes, did he read Isaiah 46? Because he says these words. Remember, God has just said, I know, I predict the future from the beginning. What I say will stand. I do as I please. Okay, listen to this. In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, after his conversion, says these words. It says in verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified Him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" Verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Isn't that incredible? When I read of Nebuchadnezzar, the man who was truly the head of gold, God saw this king as a king that would never equal him again. He was given this inscription of not only being the head of gold, but he was given the inscription of being the lion, the king of the animals. This king finally bows now down and acknowledges the King of Kings, that he does exactly as he pleases. And what is his pleasure, dear friends? What is God's pleasure? What was God's pleasure to Nebuchadnezzar? That he would be saved. Did God accomplish his purpose in Nebuchadnezzar? Yes. God accomplished his purpose, and that is that he saved Nebuchadnezzar. God has promised in Isaiah 46 that not only will he carry us, but he will save us. May God continue to do his good work in us.